So last weekend, Genesis 9 had us on the edge of our seats. The fight for #1 in the world was raging as Tweek, Spargo, Light, Acola, and Leo all fought for that #1 spot. On top of that, MuteAce came out of nowhere to claim second place with a broken ass with an underdog character. So I decided to analyze the top 8 so that you don't have to. Let's get into it.
What are you trying to tell me? That I can dodge bullets?
Trying to tell you that when you're ready, you won't have to.
After analyzing every set in the top 8, I've identified a theme for each set. Fair warning, this is my personal interpretation and it might not align with what the players were intending. That said, the patterns are very clear, especially with the context of LMBM happening a few weeks ago, and some of the sets here were repeats so we can see the evolution in players' game plan. If you enjoy this content, be sure to drop a like and a comment to show me that you want to see more like this. If we do get to 250 likes, I will do another analysis on Kagaribi 9, a 1,200 plus people event in Japan in 2 weeks. So that should be very interesting, a different meta, a different set of players, some invaders as well like Jazzo. Look forward to that. Let's get into our first set for this video. For our first match of analysis, we're going to go to losers round 1. It's going to be Glutonny versus Tweek. And this set has some history. And the history is almost entirely in Tweek's favor, mostly because Tweek has a lot of knowledge about Wario. Having played Wario himself, he knows a lot about what makes the character tick. And the way he usually plays the matchup is that he avoids the high payoff options. Think about like a Wario Nair, or even the Wario grabs and the waft confirms. So the way Tweek plays is he plays around these big options, which does open him up to some other options from Wario, right? So Wario can be a little bit more tricky with his movement because Tweek is mostly mitigating the close quarters, right? So that gives Wario a little bit more room because he's not getting called out on his movements. But it makes sure that Tweek is never getting hit by super high reward options. And that overall lets the dynamic eke into his favor. And that leads into our theme for this set, which is vertical control. Now, why are we talking about vertical control? The reason why is because Tweek is not playing Diddy. And I think the weird thing here is that Diddy really allows him to avoid these win conditions while still being a strong threat on his own right. We talked about this last time at the LMBM review, that Diddy has a lot of win conditions available to him. So Diddy can play around the opponent's win condition and still has some win condition of his own to play towards. Now, the thing about Seth, which is what Tweek was leaning into here, is that Seth is a little bit more linear. And while his strengths are more oppressive, right, when he does get you out of range, there's very little you can do back. It does mean that while he's playing around Glutonny's stronger tools, he is a lot more limited himself. Why do we talk about vertical control then? Well, because the issue with Seth is that his vertical control is not as great. And the nice thing about Glutonny is Glutonny has always been one of the best players in the game at controlling vertical space. Partially because Wario is insanely good at that, right? He can full hop and uses drift to get down, whereas other characters, when they full hop, are a lot more committal. Still, usually the full hops are not super strong in the current meta. The reason why is that most characters have really good anti-airs. Think about Roy, he's gonna, just like reactionary up air you or jab you. Think about a character like Aegis, right? Similar thing, uses the Mifra Nair and forward tilt. Sephiroth doesn't have the best answers to full hops. So what you'll see a lot in this game is that when Glutonny is trying to control the vertical space to avoid Sephiroth's dominant horizontal control, Tweek himself will full hop as well to turn a situation into a horizontal one. Now, the issue with this is that, as we mentioned before, the reason why Glutonny is so good at vertical control is because of that Wario airspeed. He can use that vertical range to create an alley of approach that other characters don't have while still having access to feints because of the air acceleration. And in this case, because we went to Battlefield twice in a row, also the platforms to help him out with landings. The counter side to this, Sephiroth, he doesn't really have that vertical control. He doesn't really have that flexibility. He can stay at a range as he matches full hops, which is what Tweek does very well, but that often still leaves openings for Glutonny to abuse. And that is what Glutonny definitely did, as he continuously baited Sephiroth to get into that vertical battle, and then through that vertical battle, he outplayed Tweek time and time again. The one thing that makes this interesting is that once Wing is online, this dynamic does shift, because with Wing, Sephiroth actually actually does really well in the vertical battle. He gets an extra double jump, he gets a lot more airspeed, and in general, his anti-airs become more rewarding, even though they're not necessarily better. Think about like a rising double jump nair, which leads into another double jump nair or other follow-ups, which normally doesn't happen if he doesn't have that second double jump. On top of that, he just gets more damage per hit. So think about like a landing up air becomes a lot more threatening. So the threat range is like a huge part of this dynamic, where if we think about like vanilla Seth versus Wario, the threat range for Wario is definitely bigger, even though he doesn't have a sword, right? He has that airspeed, and he is also a lot less committal, right? So when Sephiroth throws out like a forward air and he's wrong, Wario can usually make his way in. Whereas if Wario's wrong about his movements, it is still hard for Sephiroth to actually punish that. So a lot of this comes down to threat range and committing in threat range. Because if you never commit as Glutonny, then Tweek will never be scared. And if you never commit as Tweek, then Glutonny can just run in. So it's in a lot of ways a game of chicken in the context of vertical movement, which is very unique in today's meta, again, because of that committing, right? So when we think about a full hop, a lot of full hops in this game are very committal. Some of the top tiers don't have as committal of full hops. Think about like Fox or Joker, but most of the characters, when they do full hop, it is a lot more committal than, you know, like grounded movement, short hops, stuff like that. And what you find is that, especially when you look at some of the matches barely after quarantine, Leo would be very, very adept at anti-airing full hops with Byleth, using that up B especially to get people out of the air. And from that point onwards, full hops stopped really being a meta choice. And beforehand, full hops were very powerful. It lets you go over short hop pressure, etc., etc. But full hops have been going out of trend, except for this set. In this set, it was a huge, huge aspect of this game. So for your own game, something that you want to think about is like, what does a full hop add to my pressure, to my defense, to my movement? As Tony says, if you can add an extra dimension to your play, that is always, always a good thing. In the end, Tweek does switch to Diddy, but I do think his mental game, as he said himself on Twitter, was not entirely there. And Glutonny takes the win over one of his demons.
The jab lock into the forward. Oh my God.
Wow. Stop.
Before we get into the next set, I want to quickly remind everyone that I'm doing a coaching discount for the entire month of January. By using code 2023SWEEP, you'll be getting 10% off both on my site and on Metafy. Details in the description below.
Moving to the other side of losers, we have Spargo versus Acola. And the theme for this set is to identify your win cons and then to punish your opponent until your opponent stops you. And the reason why this is a theme is because of the repetitive nature of advantage state in this set. Now, Acola didn't play bad at all. I don't want to discredit him whatsoever, but he did have a very apparent pattern in his disadvantage, which was his use of minecart. And normally, the minor differences in minecart execution allow Steve players to get out of disadvantage through the repeated use of a single move, right? So think about minecart being gold, being not gold, delaying it slightly, using double jump to alter the trajectory. Stuff like that all significantly changes how the minecart works, right? Not the individual mix-up significantly changes anything, but the fact that there are so many small variations means that the way that you cover minecart is a lot more nuanced than one might think. Spargo in this situation, being extremely on point with his execution, consistently punishes almost every minecart. And the lesson to learn here, and this sounds very apparent, but a lot of people don't do this, is that you want to punish something until your opponent stops you from doing so. So if you do get a back air as Cloud on a minecart, don't assume that your opponent will adapt. Don't assume that it's not going to work anymore. You punish that minecart until your opponent shows you that it doesn't work anymore, until your opponent stops you. In this situation, Acola very much stuck to the minecart using his advantage. Another habit that Spargo punished very consistently was Acola's roll. So a huge weakness for Steve is his mobility, right? Steve is not the fastest on the ground, not the fastest in the air. His jump qualities, his airspeed, they're all subpar. So a lot of Steves will use patterns to compensate for these weaknesses. So think about the minecart, right? It gives you aerial speed. Think about a roll. It gives you ground speed, leads into the up tilt. So Spargo in this situation, identifying weaknesses very well, understands how they lead to patterns, and then punishing the opponent until it stops working. A very straightforward set, 3-0 for Spargo, and that means Acola bows out at 7.
Oh my gosh! Apologize! Apologize to me!
Getting into winners, we have Sonix versus MKLeo. Leo rocking the ages this time and taking the win home. Let's talk a little bit about what happened in this set, because the main theme here is the idea that weaknesses lead to patterns, which is something that I talked about briefly in the previous set. In this set, I want to go a little bit deeper into it because I really think it is very, very important to understand what is going on here. Now, what do I mean when I say weaknesses lead to patterns? Well, when a character has a weakness, a good player will usually do something to obfuscate that weakness. In other words, let's say Greninja has a really bad grab, so he struggles to beat shields. So a lot of top level Greninjas will use alternate methods to beat shields, which makes it seem that Greninja does fine against shield. Think about like an empty land down tilt, empty land jab, delayed landing mix-ups, stuff like that. So for Sonix versus Leo, both these characters do have weaknesses, even if they are a little bit limited, and we can see either player make great use of it. So in case of Sonix, what we see is that Sonix waits out Leo's swings. Now, what weakness is that? Well, in this case, it's less of a weakness and more of a lack of strength, right? So if we think about a character like Pyra, a lot of Pyra's safety on shield comes from a shield stun multiplier. So if you go into the code, you'll see that Pyra has a higher shield stun than normal for the properties of her moves. So in other words, her moves aren't safe because they're fast. Her moves are safe because they do extra shield stun. In other words, when they whiff a move with Pyra, there's a lot more lag than you might think if you use shield stun or shield safety as a frame of reference. So Sonix, especially in his bad situations, loves waiting out the Pyra swings and then coming in to punish. Similar for Mythra here. So a lot of her moves have less lag on shield than you might think, which makes them harder to react to. That doesn't mean that they're safe, because a lot of her tilts are still unsafe. It's just hard to react to. Again, when we recontextualize this into a whiff punish scenario, that means that her moves are relatively punishable on whiff. I'm not saying they're punishable. They're still extremely fast. The frame data is still insane, but when you wait for them, there's more of an opening than when you try to react to them on shield, which is something that Sonix does very, very well. And especially early on, you can see that Leo really struggles to cover Sonic when Sonic is in disadvantage, because Sonix is very consistent at waiting out when Leo swings preemptively and then reacts to that and uses that opening to come through. Very, very well done by Sonix. Now, Leo does swing the tide in a match and gets a reverse 3-0. And what weakness is Leo abusing there? Well, it's the weakness that Sonix needs time. In other words, he needs a little bit of space to charge up his spin dash. The way that spin dash works is that it is always invincible when you release it. However, the side B, it has a little bit of a hop before it releases, and that hop coincides with the invincibility, so you're not really going forward while using it, which means that the forward dash portion of the side B becomes very vulnerable. Now, if you charge the move enough, the hop disappears, which means that you're moving forward while invincible. This is what a lot of Sonics like to use to go through you while being uncontestable, and even possibly converting into combos, right? So if you can interrupt Sonic before he gets to move forward while turning invincible, he has a lot of a harder time keeping you out. And what Sonix does, having experience with the character, a lot of it obviously, is that he uses that bias to try to keep you out. So instead of charging side B, he will wait for you and use his speed and normals to make you whiff, and then whiff punish you. Leo plays this dynamic extremely well, understanding that Aegis naturally counters Sonic in both of these dynamics, right? Because Aegis has some of the best burst range in the game, right? Mythra especially with that dash attack, making it hard for Sonic to have time to set up a side B. And then if Sonic doesn't rely on side B, the resulting neutral interactions are also Mythra favored. She has a sword, she has amazing frame data, and it is hard to outspace her because of her burst range. So Leo tapping into that dynamic of, oh, Sonic needs time, which means that there's like this inherent 50-50 of like, will Sonic actually use time to set up side B, or will Sonic try to fight me directly if I try to interrupt him? He plays that dynamic extremely well, and that is how he gets the win in this set. Something to keep in mind against Sonic that anyone can use in their own play is that if you play around him keeping you out, right, using his normals to fight you as you try to interrupt him, you're often at a distance where you're also not at risk of getting hit by side B. The issue here is that if Sonic is ahead, they can kind of charge side B with impunity if you don't have the right burst range. So keep that in mind while you're playing against Sonic. Usually if you play a little bit more defensively, you can cover either option, but if the Sonic is committed to timing out, eventually you will have to commit, and that's where bait and punish comes in really big, which again, Leo uses a lot as well. Try to bait Sonix to release the spin dash, and then from there, Sonic is in the air and has to compensate for a slight disadvantage of being in the air. And that is where, again, Mifra is really good at capitalizing.
Oh, he's way up there, and oh yeah, I mean, Leo doing the front. Oh, you can't just run out like that.
Not at all. Not at all.
Too strong with the back air, and that's going to be the reverse 3-0 for MKLeo.
Going into the other side of winner semis, we got MuteAce, the underdog, versus Light, two of America's best. And two close quarter monsters, which is where we get into the theme of this set, a term that I use, which is coincidentally the terms. So the terms of engagement, the terms of a situation. Who decides the terms of this situation? And what do I mean by that? Well, like I said before, both of these characters thrive off of being in close quarters, right? When Peach gets you near her, she gets her combo, she gets her out of shield options, she gets her amazing legless hitboxes. She is a beast up close. Meanwhile, Fox, very similar, right? Gets that jump in there, mixes you up with the jab, the grab, the movement, the back airs, all stuff that occurs in close quarters. So usually in a lot of matchups, you have a dynamic where the ideal range for either character is different. So think about Glutonny versus Tweek, right? Glutonny wants to be up close, Tweek wants to be in the mid-range. Spargo versus Acola. Spargo wants to be in the mid-range, Acola wants to be up close. Sonix versus Leo, right? Sonix has this time advantage thing going on, whereas Leo wants to continuously be close to him. So as you can see, in all situations or in all matchups, there are situations that either player works towards that is unique from what the other player wants. Now, in this case, the situation seems extremely similar. They both want the opponent next to them. So what happens if both players want the opponent in a similar situation? That is where the terms come in. So the terms here is basically, how do you create a situation? So when Light enters close quarters on his terms, think about like a jump in there, that means that the close quarters that results from that transition is in his favor. Meanwhile, if MuteAce can create a close quarter situation, let's say he gets a turnip toss which Light shields, after which he gets to pressure Light shield with his own aerials, that means that the terms are in his favor. And what you see is that this creates a two-step process. So first, there's the fight for the terms. So are we going to enter close quarters on mine? Are we going to enter close quarters on yours? And this is honestly most of the neutral. And this is how MuteAce wins this set. It is by continuously denying Light from his terms through proper movement, and then when Light starts overcomplicating the way that he achieves his terms, that is where MuteAce tries to get his own. So what happens is when the way you try to get your terms gets denied, the game gets complex. So you try to trick your opponent, you try to deceive them, and then use that bait, use those feints to actually get your terms. The issue here is that MuteAce recognizes Light trying to feint, trying to bait MuteAce in, and then uses that room that Light gives him to instead create close quarter situations on his own terms. On top of that, of course, the conversions from either player are just insane. MuteAce getting a little bit more out of his hits in this scenario, and I especially love these toad reverses on the up B. A small tip for you guys, in case you guys don't know, Peach's reverse toad comes out faster than her normal toad. So MuteAce being extremely knowledgeable there, reversing his toad to get the hit faster on Light's up B. Good awareness, good performance from either player, and I love to see that fight for the terms. The second step is when you actually create the situation. So when you focus so much on denying your opponent their terms, on creating situations on your own terms, that mental energy is not going into abusing it. So here's the issue, right? You create a situation on your own terms, you're still not that much stronger, right? It gives you an advantage, but how big is that advantage? And a huge part of your terms is capitalizing on them. So when you do create a close quarter situation on your terms, can you actually go for the kill? Can you get a win out of that scenario? Or because you're only a slight bit stronger than your opponent, are you going to give your opponent room to interrupt and get your own hit? And I think this is where MuteAce really outperformed Light, is that when he did get into the situation that he wants, he got more consistent results. Whereas Light's offense, yes, he's still insanely good. He got close quarter situations on his own terms very frequently, but he didn't get as much out of those situations as MuteAce did as frequently. So MuteAce taking that win very, very well.
In disbelief, but it is a reality. MuteAce is headed to winners finals to face MKLeo.
So another tournament, another Glutonny versus Sonix set, and this one lasted quite a while. So we talked about this last time, and last time my theme was don't play losing matchups, and we saw Leo making the switch to a better matchup and getting the win because of this. In this scenario, Glutonny sticking to the Wario. He tried out the Wolf, and I think it was smart to do so, but at the end of the day, his Wario managed to get 2 games. So how did he do that? Well, to answer that question, I would like to go back to what we talked about in the previous video. And I talked about identifying secondary win conditions, right? So the main win conditions for Glutonny were all denied. So what are win conditions that he can still rely on? Well, there are 2 against Sonic. So one of them is KO power. So Sonic's game plan versus Wario relies on being ahead. Now, it is almost impossible for Glutonny to get ahead of Sonic. The reason why is that Sonic generally, if they're both at 0%, Sonic will generally win the neutral a little bit more often. And on top of that, the damage that Sonic does is generally higher than Glutonny. If Sonic plays a neutral well, he will not get caught by Glutonny's strong combo starters, right? So usually Sonic takes a damage lead. Now the issue is Sonic's KO power is nothing compared to Wario's, especially because if you look at the way Sonix KOs his opponents, most of the time it is through gimps. Well, good luck gimping Glutonny with Wario. So Glutonny is going to live for a long time, and he could get those early kills. And lo and behold, in both of the games that Glutonny beat Sonix, he did get that early kill. Now, when he gets that early kill, he can deny Sonix his win condition, because now the reason why Sonic does well, which is the defensive game against Wario, right? That inability for Wario to open Sonic up, it gets shut down, right? Because Wario's ahead, he gets to wait for time, he gets to play for time, and now Sonix needs to open Glutonny up to actually get that hit. And in both cases where Glutonny won, it was all done through living for a really long time, right? Win condition 1, and then 2, killing Sonic early, win condition 2. So Glutonny really striking very accurately with very thin margins in this set, eventually not taking the win home. Sonic's still extremely consistent and still capitalizing on a lot of the advantages that Sonic has, but I just like to see how Glutonny adjusts his strategy compared to last time. Made quite a splash in this set, but at the end of the day, Sonic's still the most consistent of the 2, moving on in loser's bracket.
Wario catches him.
Yeah. No, he knows. He literally can't. He can't do anything about it. Like you actually got outran, outsped.
Yep.
Like.
So, Light versus Spargo, a set that is always glowing hot. Love the aggression from both of these players. And in this situation, the theme is definitely to ban Light from our rule sets. In this set, the theme is definitely the importance of center stage. So there's a lot of contexts in which you can identify interactions. So last video, we talked a lot about like the tempo of interactions and how the tempo influences how an interaction plays out, the reads that result from an interaction, etc., etc. In this case, I would like to look at positioning rather than time, right? So space over time. And in this situation, the importance of center stage. So within the context of space, what we talked about before is the distance, right? So when your opponent wants to be close and you want to be far, that creates a dynamic based on the range between you and the opponent. Now, the issue is that this dynamic is even more complex than just the distance between you two, because there's also the distance between you two in context of the stage positioning. So for example, what you see from Leo is that he will stay at the mid-range with body left more often if the opponent's in the corner, whereas if he's in the corner himself, he will opt to go into close quarters every so often because of the context of the stage positioning, right? Trying to get out of the corner, getting closer to the center. Now in this situation, it is very similar, right? Spargo wants to keep Light at the mid-range, whereas Light wants to get up close, but the importance of stage cannot be understated in this matchup, because both of these characters have a huge weakness in their offstage play, to the degree that Spargo, takes a lot of stocks just as off of Light being offstage, even taking the first stock that way. Now, something important to keep in mind in this context is that a gimp usually has a couple of steps. So a lot of people are like, I'll throw my opponent off stage and then I'll gimp them. But what happens in this game is that often if you do throw your opponent off stage from center, it is very hard to still be close enough to contest them before they recover. So what you often find in top level play is that someone first pushes the opponent off stage or into the corner, and then from that corner pressure, they throw them off stage, and they're in a position to actually follow up with offstage pressure. And that's what we saw a lot in this game, is that when Spargo got those early kills on Light especially, he would first push Light off stage, then put him in the corner, then push him off stage again, and then contest the recovery. So it is always that step process. And now Light could do the same against Spargo. And because of that, either player are trying to avoid the corner at all costs. Because let's say you're playing neutral and you're pushed into the corner and you lose neutral from the corner position, that already puts them in the spot where they can follow up and pressure you off stage. So losing neutral from the center is extremely critical at increasing the longevity of your stocks. Now, both of these players are extremely tuned into fast play, and with that, player reads. And when player reads become a strong focus in the game, and both players are at the same level, it is hard to outread your opponent. It is also hard to avoid all reads entirely. So what happens is that a big factor in who wins is the risk reward management, right? If you can read your opponent and your opponent can read you and you have the better risk reward, that often means that you're going to win. So again, that risk reward, we can contextualize that in the importance of center stage. So both of these players are continuously avoiding the edge of the stage, and through that improving their risk reward management. What we see is that eventually Spargo starts focusing more on that player read, and Light keeps that importance of center stage in the back of his mind, and through that he plays from center very well and takes the win home.
That's it! And his last position going to benefit Light. I mean, that was just simply incredible. Pop-off deserved bounce back game from what we saw in game number 4 to take that definitively in game 5.
Moving into winners finals, the impossible matchup, MKLeo 4th seed coming into winners finals to reclaim his throne, and MuteAce, the underdog today, representing Peach. And the lesson, the theme for this set is that forward movement is earned, and my god, these players prove that. Peach, known as a character that is relatively slow. Meanwhile, Byleth, known as a character that can control that space in front of him very, very well. And what we saw is that MuteAce really fought for that forward movement, and he was careful about moving forward, knowing that Leo controlled that space. Now here's the issue: Leo controlling that space is not scary to MuteAce if MuteAce slowly takes it, and MuteAce was very patient about slowly taking it. Now what is scary about slowly taking it is when Leo uses the threat of controlling that space to claim it while MuteAce is respecting Leo. So what do I mean by that? Well, imagine MuteAce dashing forward and Leo doing a short hop. Now, you would assume that Leo is going to space a forward air. So MuteAce is going to play defensively, preemptively, to counter that forward air claiming the space. Leo can then use that defense, use that respect to set up an advantageous mix-up. However, a lot of this advantageous mix-up is related to coming into close quarters, right? Leo, especially with Byleth, likes to mix up with the Nair tying mix-up, with the dash grab, with the down tilt as a spacing tool. But you know, like the down tilt doesn't really mix up with a lot. So it's really like that Nair and a grab that open MuteAce up that really change the dynamic of the situation. Now the issue is, if MuteAce understands that Leo wants to contest MuteAce, that means that MuteAce is gonna have a field day, because now Byleth is coming towards Peach, and we saw this where MuteAce would use float-in up airs to counter the way that Leo is walling. Because if Leo is not retreating entirely, that means that with Peach's insane airspeed and air acceleration, she can definitely interrupt Byleth's walling. That said, if Leo constantly moves back all the time, he eventually gets to a point where he's cornered, and when he's cornered, well, that means that he cannot retreat from MuteAce anymore, and MuteAce corner pressure is insane. So what you see from Leo is that he often retreats just enough to have a little bit of space left, and then he plays the mix-up. Is he going to retreat further and have no space left, or is this the moment that he's going to fight before he's fully cornered? This dynamic is very interesting because, as you can see, both of these players are earning forward movement. MuteAce, from the beginning, has to earn it more, right? Because there is that range deficit. But Leo has to earn that forward movement as well, has to condition passivity out of MuteAce. Once that passivity is conditioned from Leo, he can then move forward and mix MuteAce up. That said, a huge element that changes this dynamic is the turnip. So once MuteAce has a turnip in hand, suddenly he has range that compares to Byleth, and at that moment, forward movement, again, it has to be earned back, because what you see is that MuteAce is often retreating, plucking a turnip to become stronger, and then tries to use that strength to push forward. And again, the dynamic shifts, but it's all about that forward movement. Right now, Leo a little bit more scared to move forward because the turnip is, one, controlling that space that he's normally controlling himself, and two, giving MuteAce a stronger out of shield option as well. MuteAce playing extremely patiently, understanding that, hey, if you actually want to pressure me, you do have to take a risk, and then zooms in on those risks and really, really abuses them whenever he gets the solid read on Leo. And keep in mind, if MuteAce is correct, he gets a full combo. If Leo is correct, he usually gets a bit of a walling poke. It is not as rewarding, and that is a huge part of the dynamic of what makes Peach a strong character. And MuteAce is going to advance into Grand Finals winner side from nowhere.
He's going to Grand Final. He did it. We saw him against Light in a triumphant down to the wire Game 5 in semis. He brings that same efficiency and confidence to Game 4 against MKLeo, and he is solidified in Grand Finals of Genesis 9. Have a seat, sir. That is your stage.
Moving into losers finals, we got Leo versus Light, Mexico's finest versus America's finest. And the lesson for today is to try to build your plan around your strongest option. And Leo definitely building around that Joker Nair in this scenario. Joker Nair, the center point of his control. You can see in the way that he mixes up that he uses the control of Joker Nair to get his other position. So think about the threat of a Joker Nair and then reading a jump. The threat of a Joker Nair and then doing time mix-ups on his landing. The threat of a Joker Nair and then mixing up the drift in and out. And all of these mix-ups form the basis of Leo's plan. Now Light, on the other hand, also building his plan around his strongest option. He is building his plan around Fox Nair, right? Fox Nair being an extremely strong zone breaker, safe on shield, leads to high reward. The issue here is that Leo was a step ahead. So a related advice to this topic is that you want to build your plan around countering your opponent's strongest option as well. And last time we talked about how Leo keeps his information inflow pure, right? So that his reactions are more powerful. This time we actually saw Leo implement footstool out of shields to counter Light's Nair based game plan. Footstool out of shield adding a little bit of noise to the information you're looking for because you're trying to discern the landing option, but also the spacing and the timing, which is a lot more complex than just, like what Leo was doing in the previous set at LMBM. But it does lead to Light playing a little bit more careful because now that plan that is focused around a single option, Nair, becomes more complex because you cannot just Nair as you can usually do against Leo. That said, Light did have his own adaptations, especially the counters. What do I mean by that? Well, in the previous set of LMBM, a commenter pointed out that a huge part of this set was the way that Leo used out of shield counters to mitigate Light's pressure, which makes a lot of sense, right? Joker's counter is the fastest counter in the game at frame 3, which means that out of shield it can be frame 6. That is an extremely fast out of shield option and can definitely stop Light from continuing to press buttons. That said, in this set, every single time Leo went for the out of shield counter, it did not work out for him. That said, the way Leo threw Light off of his game by denying him to rely on his own Nair and by establishing his own Nair game plan a lot more potently this time, I will say. I think in the previous set, Leo was focused a little bit too much on whiff punishing in a situation where, that is playing into what Light wants, right? Light knows how Fox's whiffs work and how to use them to bait Leo into thinking he can whiff punish and then counter. This time around, Leo establishing his own threat rather than reacting to his opponent's threat with that Nair, right? Establishing problems, controlling the tempo, and through that tempo control creates more openings and then abuses those with his mix-ups. Very well done by Leo, and that means he's going to get his revenge against MuteAce in the Grand.
He's gone though. He gets the play and gets the dub. Another reverse 3-0 for MKLeo. This time taking out Light and taking himself to Grand Finals.
Moving into Grand Finals, we got Leo versus MuteAce, but this time Leo rocking the Joker full time. And the theme of this set is going to be playing around resources. Now, why do we talk about resources? Well, there are there are a lot of ways to interpret resources, but there's two main ways that we want to focus on for this analysis. So the first one is like concrete resources. Think about having a turnip, the Rebels gauge. And I think this really painted the difference between these players. I feel like the thing that I really admire from Leo in this set is how consistently he switches gears when that turnip is on the field. Additionally, he is constantly aware of the status of his Arsene meter, of the Rebels gauge, and that really changes how interactions should be played. Now, I don't want to discredit MuteAce. I think MuteAce played beautifully, but I do think that there were times where MuteAce was not really considering the Rebels guard in his decisions enough. Now, the thing that I like about Leo in this context is that not only is he considering the turnips the Arsene bar, etc., etc., he's also considering that in the context of stage control as well. So stage control is another resource that you can play with. So some resources in this game, of course, are, like I said, the concrete resources. There's stage control. There's also the time that you have, right? So Sonic's really dealing in time. But there's also reads, right? Reads are also resources that you can spend to show your opponent that, hey, I have this read. You can also save it and save it for later, etc., etc. So in this situation, what we really saw is like a huge amount of play around the resource of Turnip, the resource of Arsene, and the resource of Float, which we'll get into a little bit more later. And then we contextualize that into the stage control, and it makes it even more impressive. Now, the thing about this matchup that I think can make it a little bit rough for Peach is that Joker is allowed to not fight for forward movement. So Joker gets to retreat and retreat and retreat, and then use his amazing mobility, especially his amazing vertical mobility. A little bit similar to Wario in that regard, right? But Wario has that that horizontal burst of movement in his verticality. Joker is purely vertical, right? Having a 90% fastfall speed, whereas the normal fastfall speed in the cast is 60%, to really enable some vertical mix-ups. On top of that, having an amazing landing aerial in there and having his down guns as well. So obviously Joker has like a lot of ways to reversal the position just through that vertical movement, and on top of that, he has arguably the best role in the game, moving insane distance. And that, especially for Peach, is really hard because Peach wants to be up close to fight you, and while she's up close, she's not covering your role in distance. So there are two extremely powerful ways for Leo to get control of the stage back after he has cornered himself. That means that he doesn't have to fight as much for forward movement, and he gets to retreat repeatedly, and really test MuteAce's patience. Now, on top of that, an extremely important element to this grand finals is the resource of Float. So Float obviously really centers the game around it as a mechanic, right? So there's float aerials, which are fast moves that have no lag, which is very rare. There is double jump, float, cancel, fast fall, which MuteAce uses repeatedly to avoid Leo's pressure. There is float for recovery, right? There is float for high float mix-ups. There are so many ways to use float. Float is arguably the best mechanic in the game in terms of accessibility as well as power. What Leo does very well is that Leo pays close attention to the availability and possibilities of float. So something to keep in mind that does make float a lot weaker is that if you grab the ledge, you don't get float back. So normally when you grab the ledge, you get your double jump back, you get your air dodge back, but you don't get your float back. Peach has to land on the stage. So what you often see Leo do is when he pushes MuteAce off stage, he forces MuteAce to use float. This makes Peach's ledge game significantly worse. And then once the ledge game is worse, Leo has even more of an advantage to repeat. And even if he doesn't hit MuteAce out of his float, he still stops MuteAce from using it when he gets close to the ledge, and that is the most important thing. So MKLeo, I think the thing that differentiated him in this set is that he really pushed further beyond in terms of his awareness, playing around Turnip, Arsene, Float in the context of the stage, all extremely well, and then mitigating a lot of the reads that MuteAce did get, and all that came together to get him his Genesis 9 victory, reestablishing Leo as the best player in Smash Ultimate.
Game 5, everyone wants to see it go down to the wire. Leo just trying to close this out. Is the back air enough? He's gonna do it!
It is yet again the top of the mountain achieved as MKLeo is your Genesis 9 champion. Hard-fought battle from MuteAce, but it was not enough in the run-back exchange and with the 2 sets and with the game 4, and it gave us all a thrill. But that man right there might just be back on the top of the mountain.
Just
another top 8, another interesting prospect for the meta, and I think what we saw in this top 8 that really excites me is variety, right? So when this game came out, a lot of people were like, well, all the characters kind of got, you know, they got pulled to the same kind of level, right? So a lot of unique tools were nerfed. Think about Corin Pin, now a lot worse. Think about Rosalina's Luma, a lot worse. Sonic Spin Dash, Diddy Banana, Sheik's frame data, right? Like a lot of frame data got made better. A lot of these unique tools got nerfed. Movement got buffed universally, right? Dash tilts, never usable before. Jump squats, now all frame 3 except for Kazuya. But you get what I mean, right? Like a lot of the universal universal properties were buffed in Smash Ultimate, whereas the unique properties were generally nerfed. Now, if we look at the current state of the meta, we see a lot of that uniqueness return. We see Wario with that vertical control, something that was written off just a few years ago. Now, again, a huge factor in the way that Glutonny plays a lot of his matchups. We see Sonic specifically dealing in time in a meta where beforehand people were really focusing on a stage control based approach based on MKLeo's adaptations, right? So Leo very consistent at pushing someone into the corner, playing a stage control based game, and really like winning based on basically pushing people into the corner or forcing them to make bad decisions to not end up in the corner. Again, we now see Sonic, who introduces a new dynamic where time is the most important factor. We saw Spargo versus Acola, where instead of relying on continuous mix-ups to stay unpredictable, Spargo just hammering home a weakness until the character loses, right? And that is something that, again, like if you think about a character like Sheik, right, who was good in Smash 4, or even an early meta character for Smash Ultimate, think about something like Wolf. He will always have other options to tackle a situation, whereas if you want to beat Steve, you gotta get good at punishing that same weakness repeatedly, accurately, perfectly almost, until he dies. We see a character like Peach thriving in a meta where usually we feel like slower characters don't really work, right? Not counting Steve because he's fast in his minecart. Mute proving that this character, Peach, can still function in this fast-paced meta just because of the other properties of the character, right? The punish game, the technical execution needed to get there is rough, but once you get there, you have moves that have, again, low startup, low lag, which is very, very hard to beat. Using turnips, using items as a main resource. Again, something that we don't often see in this meta. We do see items, right? Think about banana, think about gyro, but the way that turnip is used is very different in the context of Peach's kit. I could go on, but really what we're seeing is diversity, and the more diversity, the better, because it means that the skills that are tested throughout a bracket are more extensive, which means that the results are generally more accurate. If you are a player who specializes in a specific type of gameplay, you are less likely to get far, whereas if you are a more well-rounded player, you will be more likely to get far. Because there are more axes to test a player on, you will more often find the most skilled player accurately. Again, this is just one of them, interpretations of the Genesis 9 top 8. Hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to support the channel, and I'll see you guys next time. Stay smart.